Sarah Martinez pulled her small rolling suitcase down the narrow airplane aisle, checking her boarding pass one more time. Seat 15A. The window seat she had specifically requested for the long flight from San Diego to Washington, D.C. At first glance, Sarah looked like any other tired traveler. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore comfortable jeans, sneakers, and a plain gray sweatshirt. Nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary life she led. As she approached row 15, Sarah noticed the two men already seated in the middle and aisle seats. They were both wearing expensive suits and had the confident posture of business executives. The man in 15B, a heavy-set gentleman with graying hair, looked up from his laptop with obvious annoyance as Sarah stopped beside their row. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "I have the window seat." The man in 15C, younger with perfectly styled blonde hair, let out an exaggerated sigh. "Great. We're going to have to get up every time she needs to use the bathroom," he muttered to his colleague, loud enough for Sarah to hear. Both men reluctantly stood, making no effort to move gracefully. The older man held his laptop protectively against his chest, as if Sarah might damage it simply by walking past. As she squeezed by, she heard him whisper to the other, "I hate middle seats on these packed flights. Always get stuck next to people who probably can't even afford business class." Sarah settled into her seat quietly, placing her small backpack under the seat in front of her. She had learned long ago not to respond to such comments. People made assumptions based on appearances, and she had grown used to it over the years. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them, she figured. The man in 15B, who introduced himself loudly to his seatmate as Robert Chen, Senior Vice President of Pacific Financial, continued his conversation as if Sarah wasn't there. "The government contracts we're going after are worth millions. These military people don't understand real business, though. They're all about following orders and protocols instead of innovation." His companion, who called himself Derek Williams from Williams Marketing Solutions, nodded in agreement. "Tell me about it. I've worked with some of these military contractors before. They act like they're so important because they wear uniforms. Most of them probably never even saw real action. Just desk jockeys playing soldier." Sarah opened a book and tried to focus on reading, but the men's voices carried clearly in the cramped space. She noticed other passengers glancing their way, some looking uncomfortable with the loud conversation. "The worst part is when they try to act all superior," Robert continued, adjusting his expensive watch. "Like that pilot we met last month. Some woman who claimed she flew fighter jets. Yeah, right. Probably flew cargo planes, if anything. These diversity hires are getting out of hand." Derek laughed. "Women pilots in combat roles? Please. They probably just let them fly because of political correctness. No way they could handle the real pressure of actual combat missions." Sarah's grip tightened slightly on her book, but her expression remained calm. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times throughout her career. The assumptions, the dismissive attitudes, the casual disrespect. It never got easier, but she had learned to choose her battles carefully. As the plane began to taxi for takeoff, a flight attendant made her way down the aisle, checking that everyone was properly buckled in. When she reached row 15, she noticed Sarah's military ID partially visible in her wallet as she reached for her phone. "Thank you for your service," the flight attendant said quietly to Sarah with a warm smile. Robert and Derek exchanged glances. "Service?" Derek asked with a smirk. "What kind of service? Food service?" The flight attendant looked shocked by the comment, but continued down the aisle without responding. Sarah simply nodded politely and returned to her book. Once they were airborne and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the two businessmen resumed their conversation with even more enthusiasm. They discussed their upcoming meetings, their expensive cars, and their frustrations with what they called government inefficiency. The problem with military leadership these days, Robert declared while opening a small bottle of premium whiskey he had purchased, is that they promote people based on quotas instead of merit. Real leaders are made in boardrooms and business schools, not in some basic training camp. Derek nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Give me a Harvard MBA over some random soldier any day. At least business people understand how the real world works. A few passengers in nearby seats shifted uncomfortably. An elderly man wearing a veteran's cap turned around with a stern expression, but his wife gently pulled his arm to discourage any confrontation. Sarah continued reading, though she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. She was listening to every word, processing the casual disrespect and ignorance with the patience she had developed over years of proving herself in environments where she was consistently underestimated. As the flight continued, Robert and Derek ordered another round of drinks, and their conversation grew louder and more inappropriate. They began rating the female passengers and flight attendants, making comments about their appearances and speculating about their backgrounds. That one probably works at some retail job, Derek said, nodding toward a young woman reading a medical textbook. Trying to look smart with that book. Sarah finally closed her book and turned to look out the window. Below, she could see the patchwork of farmland and small towns stretching toward the horizon. She thought about all the training flights she had taken over similar landscapes, the countless hours of preparation and study, the missions she had flown in far more challenging conditions than these two men could imagine. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, sitting in seat 15A, being dismissed and disrespected by two men who had probably never been tested beyond their comfort zones, who had never had to prove themselves under life-or-death pressure, who had never been responsible for equipment worth millions of dollars or the safety of their teammates. But Sarah Martinez had learned that the best response to ignorance was often patience. Soon enough, she thought to herself, the truth has a way of revealing itself. The flight was halfway to Washington when turbulence began to shake the aircraft. What started as gentle bumps quickly escalated into serious jolting that had passengers gripping their armrests. The captain's voice came over the intercom, asking everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. Robert Chen looked genuinely nervous for the first time during the flight. His expensive whiskey had spilled across his laptop, and he was frantically trying to dry it with napkins. "This pilot better know what he's doing," he muttered, his earlier confidence completely gone. Derek Williams had turned pale and was gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. "I hate when flights get rough like this. You never know if these commercial pilots are really qualified for emergency situations." Sarah noticed their distress, but remained completely calm. Her hands stayed relaxed in her lap, and her breathing remained steady. She had experienced turbulence far worse than this, in aircraft much less stable than the commercial airliner they were on. A young mother sitting across the aisle began to panic as her baby started crying loudly. The woman was clearly a nervous flyer, and the rough air was making her increasingly agitated. "Is this normal?" she called out to no one in particular. "Is the plane okay?" Several passengers looked around anxiously, but no one seemed to have answers. The flight attendants were strapped into their seats, unable to move around the cabin during the turbulence. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and carefully moved across the aisle to the distressed mother. "Ma'am, this is completely normal," she said in a calm, confident voice that somehow cut through the noise and chaos. "The aircraft is designed to handle much worse conditions than this. The pilots have extensive training for situations exactly like this." The woman looked up at Sarah with grateful eyes. "How do you know? Are you sure?" "I'm very sure," Sarah replied with quiet authority. "Turbulence feels scary, but modern aircraft are incredibly strong. The pilots up front have dealt with this thousands of times. Your baby can sense your stress, so if you stay calm, they'll calm down too." Her words had an immediate effect. Not only did the young mother's breathing slow down, but other nearby passengers seemed to relax as well. There was something in Sarah's tone and demeanor that inspired confidence. Robert had been listening and couldn't help but interject. "What makes you such an expert?" he asked with a sneer, though his voice still carried traces of nervousness. "Did you read that in some airline magazine?" Sarah returned to her seat without answering, but Derek noticed something that Robert had missed. When Sarah had moved to help the mother, her sweatshirt had shifted, revealing what looked like the edge of a tattoo on her shoulder. It wasn't a decorative design, but what appeared to be military wings. "Did you see that?" Derek whispered to Robert, nodding toward Sarah. "See what?" Robert was still focused on his damaged laptop. "Her tattoo. Looked like some kind of military thing." Robert glanced over at Sarah, who was once again calmly reading her book. "Probably fake. Lots of people get military tattoos to look tough. Besides, even if she was in the military, that doesn't mean much. Could have been a secretary or something." The turbulence continued for another 20 minutes, but Sarah's intervention had helped keep the passengers in their section calm. She had quietly moved around to check on several elderly passengers, helped a teenager who was traveling alone, and even assisted a businessman who had spilled coffee all over his documents. Each time she helped someone, she did so with a competence and authority that seemed natural and well-practiced. She knew exactly how to project calm confidence in stressful situations, how to give people just enough information to feel reassured without overwhelming them with details. When the turbulence finally ended and the captain announced they could move about the cabin again, many passengers in their section had noticed Sarah's leadership during the crisis. The elderly veteran with the cap approached her seat. "Thank you for helping everyone back there," he said quietly. "I could tell you know what you're doing. What branch did you serve in?" Sarah smiled politely. "Air Force, sir." The veteran's eyes lit up with recognition and respect. "I thought so. You have that pilot bearing. What did you fly?" Before Sarah could answer, Robert interrupted loudly. "Air Force? Let me guess, transport planes? Maybe some desk job at an air base somewhere?" The veteran turned to look at Robert with disgust. "Son, you clearly don't know anything about military service. This lady helped keep everyone calm during that turbulence like someone with real training and experience." Derek joined the conversation. "Come on, old man. Just because someone was in the military doesn't make them special. Lots of people serve in support roles. It's not like she was actually flying combat missions or anything important." The veteran's face turned red with anger. But before he could respond, a group of passengers in military uniforms began boarding the plane during a brief stop in Phoenix. They were clearly returning from deployment, carrying military-issued duffel bags and wearing their dress uniforms. Among them were several young officers who looked to be in their mid-20s. As they made their way down the aisle looking for their seats, one of them spotted Sarah and stopped dead in his tracks. "Is that?" he whispered to his companion, staring directly at Sarah. His fellow officer followed his gaze, and his eyes went wide with recognition. Both young men looked like they had just seen a celebrity. They whispered frantically to the other military passengers behind them, pointing discreetly toward row 15. Sarah noticed the commotion, but kept her expression neutral. She had learned over the years that sometimes it was better to travel anonymously to avoid the attention that her reputation sometimes brought. Robert and Derek observed the military passengers' behavior with confusion. "What's got them all excited?" Robert wondered aloud. "Probably just happy to be going home," Derek replied dismissively. "Military people get emotional about weird things." But the elderly veteran had noticed the reaction too, and his expression was changing from curiosity to amazement. He looked at Sarah with new understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle were suddenly falling into place. One of the young officers was clearly debating whether to approach Sarah. He kept glancing her way while his friends tried to convince him to leave her alone. Finally, his companion pushed him forward slightly. "Just go ask," the friend whispered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You'll regret it if you don't." The young officer straightened his uniform and began walking slowly toward row 15, his eyes fixed on Sarah with unmistakable respect and admiration. Other passengers began to take notice of the developing situation. Robert and Derek watched with growing confusion as the officer approached. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would completely change their understanding of the woman sitting quietly in seat 15A. The young officer reached row 15 and stopped directly beside Sarah's seat. His posture was respectfully rigid, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the quiet cabin. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone filled with unmistakable reverence. "Are you Colonel Sarah Martinez?" Sarah looked up from her book and smiled gently. "I am. And you are?" "Lieutenant James Park, ma'am, 144th Fighter Wing." His voice was slightly shaking with excitement. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, it's an incredible honor to meet you. You're a legend at the Academy." Robert and Derek exchanged confused glances. "Colonel?" Their dismissive smirks began to fade as they realized something significant was happening. Sarah nodded modestly. "Thank you, Lieutenant. How's your training going?" "Exceptional, ma'am. Actually, ma'am, if I may." Lieutenant Park's voice grew more excited. "I've studied every one of your missions in my tactical training courses. The Libya rescue operation, the Syria reconnaissance flights, the Afghanistan close air support missions. We study your techniques in advanced fighter tactics class." The entire section of the plane had gone completely silent. Every passenger was now listening to this conversation with rapt attention. Robert's face had turned pale, and Derek looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. "What aircraft do you fly, Lieutenant?" Sarah asked with genuine interest. "A-10 Thunderbolts, ma'am, but I'm hoping to qualify for F-16s next year. Just like you flew, ma'am." The elderly veteran who had spoken with Sarah earlier was now grinning widely. He had moved closer to listen, and his chest was swelling with pride as he realized exactly who had been sitting near him. Lieutenant Park continued, his voice gaining strength. "Ma'am, the instructors always tell us about Phoenix 1. They say if we can fly half as well as Phoenix 1, we might survive combat. Is it true you flew 147 combat missions over 3 deployments?" Sarah's call sign, Phoenix 1, the name that was spoken with reverence in military aviation circles around the world. "The missions were a team effort, Lieutenant. I was fortunate to fly with the best pilots and crew in the Air Force." But Lieutenant Park wasn't finished. "Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like my squadron mates to meet you. We have some A-15 personnel on board who would be honored to pay their respects." Sarah glanced around the cabin and noticed that nearly every passenger was staring. She had hoped to travel quietly, but she also understood the importance of these moments for young military personnel. "Of course, Lieutenant. I'd be happy to meet them." Lieutenant Park waved toward the back of the plane, and within moments, 8 more military personnel had gathered around row 15. They formed a respectful semicircle, all standing at attention, despite being in civilian clothes or off-duty uniforms. A female captain stepped forward. "Colonel Martinez, Captain Lisa Chen, A-15 Falcon Squadron. Ma'am, the entire squadron knows about your record. 15 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, over 200 successful close air support missions, and 3 distinguished flying crosses. You're the reason many of us chose fighter aviation." Robert Chen, who shared a surname with the captain, looked absolutely mortified. This was the same woman he had been ridiculing for the past several hours, calling her a diversity hire and questioning whether women could handle combat roles. Derek had gone completely silent, staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. Another officer, a young major, spoke up. "Ma'am, is it true you were the first female pilot to achieve ace status in the 21st century?" "The military doesn't officially recognize ace status anymore, Major. But I was fortunate to serve during a time when I could prove that capability matters more than gender." The captain continued. Ma'am, we also heard about your test pilot work. The experimental stealth fighter program, the high-altitude reconnaissance systems. The new pilots coming out of training today are flying with systems you helped develop and test. Sarah smiled. That work was classified until recently. You all certainly stay informed. Yes, ma'am. Your innovations in combat tactics are required study material. The Phoenix maneuver is now standard doctrine for close air support in urban environments. By now, the entire cabin was listening in stunned silence. Flight attendants had stopped their service to watch the impromptu military gathering. Passengers were pulling out their phones to record the remarkable scene. An older master sergeant stepped forward. Colonel Martinez, ma'am, I served in Afghanistan during your 2018 deployment. My unit was pinned down near Kandahar when you provided air support. You saved 14 lives that day, including mine. His voice cracked slightly with emotion. Ma'am, I've wanted to thank you personally for 8 years. You and your wingman held off enemy forces for 45 minutes until ground reinforcements arrived. The Taliban had us surrounded, and we wouldn't have made it home without your intervention. Sarah stood up and shook the master sergeant's hand. Sergeant, it was our honor to support ground troops. That's what we trained for. No, ma'am. It was more than that. You came in low under heavy enemy fire, made multiple attack runs to break their positions, and stayed on station longer than your fuel should have allowed. Command called it one of the most heroic close air support missions of the entire conflict. The young lieutenant who had started the conversation spoke again. Colonel, the instructors tell us you retired as the most decorated female combat pilot in Air Force history. Is it true you turned down a promotion to general so you could keep flying? I loved flying, Lieutenant. Command positions are important, but my heart was in the cockpit. Robert Chen finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. I had no idea. Ma'am, I apologize for my comments earlier. I was completely out of line. Sarah turned to look at Robert with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the flight. Mr. Chen, I appreciate your apology. People often make assumptions. What matters is how we learn from our mistakes. Derek was still speechless, but his face showed complete shame and regret. The master sergeant wasn't finished. Ma'am, there's something else. My daughter is starting at the Air Force Academy next year. She wants to be a pilot like you. When I told her I might get to meet Phoenix 1 on this flight, she made me promise to tell you something. He paused, clearly emotional. She said to tell you that you proved it could be done, that women could excel in combat aviation. She's not just following in your footsteps, ma'am. You cleared the path for her to walk. Sarah's composed expression softened for just a moment. Tell your daughter that the sky belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. Gender, background, none of that matters once you're flying. Only skill and dedication. One by one, each military member shook Sarah's hand and thanked her for her service. They shared stories of how her missions had inspired their careers, how her innovations had kept them safer, and how her example had opened doors for others. As they returned to their seats, the entire cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers who had been listening to the conversation stood up to clap for the woman who had been sitting quietly among them for hours. The elderly veteran approached Sarah one last time. Colonel, I served in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot. I've seen real courage, and I've seen people who talk about courage. Thank you for being the real thing. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., Robert and Derek sat in complete silence. The woman they had spent hours dismissing and ridiculing was one of the most accomplished military pilots in American history. Sarah returned to her book, but the atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. Passengers continued to approach her throughout the remainder of the flight, thanking her for her service and asking respectful questions about her career. When the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Sarah gathered her simple backpack and prepared to leave. As she stood up, Robert Chen touched her arm gently. Colonel Martinez, I want you to know that I learned something important today. I was wrong about everything. Thank you for your grace in how you handled my ignorance." Sarah nodded. "Mr. Chen, we all have opportunities to grow. What matters is taking them." As she walked down the aisle toward the exit, every military member on the plane stood at attention in their seats. It was an impromptu honor guard for a true American hero. The woman who had been ridiculed in seat 15A walked off the plane with the respect and recognition she had always deserved, her call sign Phoenix 1 having reminded everyone on board that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like.